So hello and welcome back. And for those of you that have been following us in the last episode or previous episode, you would have had an introduction to one of our really good clients who has agreed to go on this little journey with us so that you, the audience, can learn what the journey has been like in purchasing a commercial property. So I'd like to welcome back Andrew Gemmell, who is back with us on the show today. How are you going, Andrew?
Oh, I'm well. Thanks, Mish. How are you?
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for joining us yet again.
No, it's good. It's a good conversation. Yeah.
What we're going to dive into this week is just a couple of questions that we put together, explaining the journey and how you felt about the journey of purchasing a property and how long it took. So without further ado, let's dive in. Okay, so Andrew, let's have a look at a couple of the properties that we went through before we found the golden needle, the golden goose that's laying the golden egg right now.
Well, it's one thing you call it. Yeah.
Do you remember some of the properties that we presented, and what was your reasoning for not going ahead with them?
Yes, I do. I don't remember all of them, to be honest, because it's a little while ago. And some just immediately you're like, no, it's not quite right. Some are too expensive for me, but I still got to see those properties because you can get some context around what's that next level up and what's that next level down, and playing around with that and getting context about the market, which was good. So I don't remember all of them in detail, but I think we may have touched in the last conversation. There was a place in Adelaide I definitely remember. We did touch on the retail, which could be strated, 3 of them. Strata title put over those. So I do remember that. I remember the government building. And then what I remember most clearly, it came down to 2 properties which were in the industrial space, which was the objective I was kicking off. And they were very close to each other, and just due to events that happened, which we may get into a little later, I bounced between both of those. Not so much for indecision from my part or our part. And I mean, Ari, it was more from what we were experiencing from the seller.
So just from your experience, let's just take it right from the beginning. What was your experience starting the journey? How were you feeling about it? I mean, obviously there's always excitement about it. And I always make the analogy of it's a little bit like going skydiving. You don't know what to expect until you've actually done it. So we were presenting properties and we were discussing those properties with you. What would you say your experience through that was?
It was good. It was a great experience. And just starting to look at options and really getting to understand the market and what's reality versus what you come into with, these thoughts in your head. And one of those things was a yield play for me. And I had seen people I'd known who know property well, they go direct into the market. They'd managed to pick up some 8.5% yielding properties, but they're hard to find now. And I think it was at a time when they were really capping out, and that yield has squeezed a fair bit. So I came in with a different timing in my mind of what I'd experienced there and so forth. And then by the time we started working together, things had changed a little bit in the market. So it was good to get a good update on different assets as they were coming up and really seeing what the market's doing on yield and so forth. So yeah, great experience. Talked about the pros and cons each time. Well, how did that relate to what my or our family's objective was initially? And I wasn't really that open-minded, I'll be honest, when I started, because I came in with a fairly definitive sort of plan. But that changed as time went by. I ended up in the type of asset that.
Were those changes? What sort of mindset did you come in with, and where did you end up?
Well, I ended up where I wanted to start, actually. So we purchased an industrial property, very durable property. You could put most industrial manufacturing sort of organisations or businesses into that. But on the journey there, there was government office, there was inner city industrial, which is a little different in Adelaide. There was the retail space that we looked at as well. And a few other different types of options had popped up along the way as well. So amongst industrial property. So yeah, so that was a good learning process.
So would you say, I mean, what we were presenting, and I remember we had this conversation before, and I said, look, it is really like finding a golden needle in a golden haystack to find that perfect property that's going to tick all the boxes. And I know I say this to all clients, that there's never going to be a full schedule of box ticking that you're going to do on every single property. And often that's where the opportunities are, is to identify if there are red flags that you can fix, because those are the properties that you can basically add value to. However, we went through all of those sectors which you mentioned, which was office, government office, retail, and the purpose for going through that from our perspective would have been to be giving you the opportunity to look outside of the box, outside of what exactly your criteria was, and chasing the numbers. So did you get that kind of, is that what you were feeling about it?
Yes, I did get that feeling. And sorry to come back to your question, which I didn't actually answer. It was so that experience that I described certainly started to open up my thinking. Yeah, and open up my mind and really get out of those blinkers and go, right, there's a lot of opportunity in commercial property. It does not have to be in one sector. Look, if you're building a portfolio, you've got to think about risk. You've got to think about diversification, and really going to be closing yourself off to opportunity, particularly in commercial property where the emotional element's not as high. It's really a business-orientated purchase, investment solely. So that was a really good process. It started to change how I thought.
And if we were to have a look at the criteria that you set in evaluating the properties, we said earlier, not necessarily price, because, unlike residential, you can say, I want in this area, I want at that price, and I want that type of building. In commercial, you're looking right across the board. You're setting a budget and you're setting a criteria which needs that flexibility. So I think if I have a look at, we actually, now I'm going to throw some numbers out of there. We presented you with 22 properties.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
Some of those properties were hit and miss. Some of those properties were sold very fast, but probably out of price. And this was during 2022 going into 23. It was mainly through 2023. So the market had started shifting. And it was a wide range of properties as well. What criteria were you using to evaluate the perfect property for you? What was the deciding factor on the property that you eventually chose?
Well, my broad goal for our family was to, it still is actually, have a portfolio of $5 million worth of commercial property on purchase price, producing $350K net inflows, cash inflows a year. So that's sort of how I set the North Star for the journey. So using that 7% yield I've just described, that was one of the criteria to look at that. So more from a cash flow perspective than a capital growth perspective, and hence the regional focus there. Second was industrial, because of the durability of industrial and the durability and the versatility of it. And also just having done a little bit of research, and with your help as well in this too, just the shortage of industrial in the market, replacement costs being as high as they are, cost to build going up. We've seen that through COVID, Ukraine, etc., building costs, inflation, all of it coming into the picture. So that was part of it. And to get those yields, I looked at regional, which I always had in mind, regional, with that objective. And so we were looking at the Toowoomba's and the Townsvilles, everything else in between. So that was the broad objective which was leading me down that road. Yeah.
Okay. And this property that, let's talk a little bit about the property that you eventually settled on, because it had a couple of red flags when we presented it. And I think the first thing was that it was owner-occupied, that it was a lease. And do you want to talk us through that process, how you felt about it, what you learned from that process?
Yeah, look, initially, when you presented that property to me and we had a discussion about it, it did tick a lot of boxes. Like, I instantly went, yeah, this is where I'd like to really spend some more time in here. Let's have a look at this one. The sale leaseback, the whole experience was new for me, but sale leaseback was quite different to, obviously just a vendor on selling and so forth. So that was a great experience. So the zero sort of fear factor in going into that territory, because I know a lot of those transactions happen, but the antenna is certainly up. The risk antenna, for sure, because of that. There's a little bit of a conflicted interest in there when you're the tenant and you're the owner, and there's a bit to work through to make sure that you're on the right track and you've got the right partner. From a vendor point of view, you're going to be working with and everything's sort of playing out as well as it can. So that the risk orientation that I carried kicked into gear with, obviously along with yourself and the due diligence process. So, but the property itself, yeah, I thought it was attractive, and it was sort of in that sweet spot, price sweet spot, yield, was solid on it. Yeah, let's take it on and see what's under the hood at the time.
Yeah, so there were a couple of hairy moments, if I remember correctly, where particularly around the lease, because bearing in mind that this property did not have a lease when we started this journey. And one of the biggest takeaways, I think, for the audience would be that I was very insistent that this lease be executed pre-unconditional. And I know we had a lot of pushback from the tenant, who's the vendor, as well as the agent who was handling it. And there was a lot of questioning and querying. Do you remember those little debates and conversations and how we tactfully worked our way around that?
Yeah, I do. And a huge thank you and the value working with someone like you, Mish, comes out in those scenarios for sure. If you left that till later, yeah, it'd be very awkward. You'd probably, possibly when it came to lease, I guess, negotiation and fine tuning, you're going to be in a position where you've lost some of that power or some of that bargaining play. So, and you're going to have someone walk away who may have bought a property, but they're actually not happy with the scenario. So
realistically, if you leave that after unconditional, they can write whatever they want in that lease.
Yeah.
And I just don't understand why buyers would do that. Why would you want to do that? Why would you want to put yourself in that situation? That the selling agent's always going to push for it, and the seller or the vendor is always going to push for it. But you really got to fight hard and fight back. So we worked very well as a team there, Andrew. I can't take all the credit for that. I think we both worked as a good team in articulating what needed to be done in the lease and what your requirements were as an owner of that building. I think if I remember correctly, the vendor was looking at it obviously to his advantage, and our feedback was a lease is a document that needs to be fair and equitable to all parties.
Yep.
So what would be fair? So let's go through that lease for just a brief moment and speak a little bit about the deal. So it's an industrial deal. It's in Townsville, and the lease is 2 years. Now, we do know that the tenant is exiting the property. You were aware of that right from the get-go, and hence the 7% yield. Okay. So the risk. What did you feel about that in terms of the risk for you?
The 2 years obviously is upfront, so that wasn't so much a risk for me, but maximizing how they exit that property, obviously make good comes into it, because there's a bit of work to be done, and you want that ready as much as possible for the next tenant. That was one part of it. But what's washing around inside that building that you don't know about was another part. Now, obviously, in coming back to the lease, they're trying to exclude that Building Act is often quoted in there. And that straight away is why. Why is that happening from the lawyers? And as it turns out, there was a certificate of completion missing from that building. So you ask the question why, you generally, and push for a why sometimes, are you going to get an answer? And well, that's it. So what does that mean? For some properties, which we'll probably talk about, because there was one nearby which had exactly the same thing going on. And once you learn to do it once, you'll definitely do it the next time. You'll learn how to deal with it, I should say, the next time. So, which we did much more efficient, have passed away on the other property, which subsequently did purchase. But pushing back on that sent the vendor back to the drawing board and going, right, what have I got to do to get this up to speed where I can actually sell it to an investor? If I happen to be an owner-occupier who was putting in my manufacturing business, I may not have cared as much because I'll just deal with that down the track. But unfortunately, you're always going to have to deal with it. Whether you're an investor or owner-occupier, you're going to have to deal with that at some point.
At stage, absolutely. Yeah.
So we stuck to our guns and we went, well, if you can deal with that and we can get this lease for unconditional, we're going to be good. We'll do the DD and we'll go with it. See where we can land. So that happened, fortunately. So, and we, fortunately for the vendor, the certificate of completion works that needed to be done. They weren't extreme or so forth. It was really, I think, a bit of a doorway, upgrading some of the fire system there. There were bits and pieces, but I don't think it was a huge process. It was probably more a pain in the backside for them, to be honest.
Which it is. And I mean, the COC, we call it the COC, is it really is a requirement, and lenders, your banks are going to be looking at that. That's going to be one of the first things that they're going to ask. Your valuers are going to be looking at that as well. So, from a building owner's perspective, don't waste time. Just get it done,
Yeah.
Whether you intend selling or not, it's just a piece of administration that is a requirement. Somewhere along the line, it is going to come along and bite you.
Yeah, I remember, Mish, there was the property nearby, whilst we put that on ice, the property nearby, which came up, which was not too dissimilar, attractive, had a stronger yield on it. I think it had about the same lease on it there from memory, lease term, I should say. Went through the same process, same conditions came out of the contract when provided, so we pushed back on that. And they were very proactive and going, right, we'll go and get an assessment on that, which cost quite a few grand actually to get the list to fix those issues was more extensive.
You remember what was on that list?
Yeah, I remember a few things. There were things like hallways weren't to regulation that were going down into the toilets. So that was going to require a whole wall and new doorways to be put in. There was question marks about a modification of the shed for a gantry crane. That's a big deal. And then there was a car park with a covering that was out the back that hadn't gone through the right channels to be built. And there are numerous things. Really good asset, really good property. A little bit more modern than the one we ended up purchasing, but all of those things said, "Oh, that's too much to really achieve." Yeah.
If I remember correctly, we got to a stage where the vendor was kind of saying, "Oh, this is going to take 6 months."
Yeah.
From my perspective, I couldn't see where he was going with 6 months, because if you really want to sell your building, you'd have a lot of those things that you mentioned sorted out a lot quicker. He could have had them done a lot quicker. So we unanimously decided to walk away from that one, and we went and reignited the flame on the property that you ended up buying. And I think for good reasons.
Yeah.
The takeaway for that is, and you get a lot of these properties that have belonged to the same owner for 20, 25 years plus. They've run their businesses out of these buildings and they've just added on and tacked on and added on and tacked on. And a lot of those buildings that they might have tacked onto the back. So this one in particular that we were talking about had a basic structure in the front. It had drive-through that went all the way down the one side, around and out the other side. And the owner of the business and building had added on some sheds in the back. And that is where the problems were with those sheds in the back. I think he'd got a couple of mates to tack those sheds up. They were fairly sturdy and stable. They just didn't go through the right certification. So something to look for in due diligence. Be aware and always ask the questions.
Yeah, the big one, I think, with that property, Mish, I looked at the drawings when we got the contract and information when we started DD there.
Yep.
And the drawings did not have a gantry crane exit and a gantry crane coming out of the building.
Yes.
In the original drawing. So straight away I'm thinking, well, the picture I'm looking at definitely has that coming out of the building. So it's there. It's not in the drawing. So someone has put it in somewhere along the line. And the vendor, I remember the vendor saying, oh, we just bought this as is, because they were going to use it and it suited them. They didn't actually put that gantry crane in. But what has happened there, as a typical owner-occupier that they didn't really care too much about it because it suited them. But now they had come to sell it. It was going to cause a headache for them. And I think, if I remember rightly, they did end up selling that place, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was going to be an owner-occupier, perhaps, or perhaps a cash buyer said, look, take a couple of $100,000 off, we'll sort it out.
They inherited the problem. I haven't followed up with it, so I couldn't tell what's the outcome. It would be interesting. We can go back and visit that and see what it is. But you're talking about gantry cranes. I want to just go back to your property with those gantry cranes, because now seeing a property with gantry cranes comes with its own set of problems.
Yeah.
Do you remember the due diligence that we did on the cranes themselves?
Yeah, well, when we did the walk around and we're asking the vendor, but how long have you been in business? Obviously, you start there, and then you see the history of the business. Will give you an idea of how it's evolved, which then gives you an idea of why there's various gantry cranes sitting in certain locations and so forth, and obviously looking at the maintenance of those and et cetera. But that business is customized for what they do. And I remember you bringing this up with me. I wasn't interested so much in the gantry cranes. I'm interested in the building. And you really reconfirmed that for me this has been customized for what they do. This is not necessarily going to suit the next person that comes in. Plus there's the maintenance, there's the age of the gantry cranes, etc. And I had a couple of mates say, well, why don't you keep those? They're amazing. You could sell them. You could sell the steel for profit. I'm like, I don't need that maintenance. I don't need the headache of getting rid of a gantry crane for steel. I just need the building, really. So, and the next tenant, they can do what they want with it.
Basically, yeah.
Because we go through the process and we negotiate. So I think I mentioned in the first chat we had, a good friend of mine, Steve McKnight, I think his motto is, you really want to be purchasing property with lowest amount of risk, with the least aggravation, and the best return.
I couldn't say it even better.
Yeah. And that rings in my head now. I weigh them up and I go, okay, aggravation is everywhere here, potentially in some places.
Yep.
Aggravation could transfer to risk, high risk. So that then changes your perspective on the return, ultimately. So
this property in particular, if I remember correctly, it had 3-ton gantry cranes that ran through the middle in 2 areas, if my memory serves me right. And then they had swing arm gantry cranes as well. Now, my biggest question for the vendor was, besides the machinery and the maintenance, how old is the mechanics on those cranes? And I remember them saying that they were pretty new because they had just replaced motors. But as it turns out, And this actually happened in the negotiation while we were standing on the floor right then. I don't know if you remember, we were talking about them. And I was saying to them, we would prefer if you remove your gantry cranes, take them with you. Because from my perspective, and I remember looking at you and you gave me a little bit of a look at that stage, because I think you were thinking to yourself steel and replacement and whatever. And I was saying, no value, seriously, because if somebody else is going to come into the building and they want gantry cranes, they're probably going to want newer cranes in better quality and positioned specifically for their needs of whatever their business is. So it's not necessarily always an advantage to be buying a commercial property with gantry cranes in them, existing gantry cranes, because they do have a lifespan. And the mechanics of that lifespan is, I'm going to say on average, after 10 years, they depreciate dramatically. You lose a lot of value on them. 15 to 20 years, they really are good for steel because the crane sells so much value. And it's the working parts that are the most expensive parts. The steel itself, the integrity of the steel is pretty much maintained, but it's the cost to replace the moving parts and the motors is where you're going to come unstuck.
Yeah.
In that conversation, the seller was saying, he wasn't too interested in the swing arm gantries, and we actually put into the contract that he removes them all so that you get a clean shell, that your new tenant who can come in can basically do whatever they want in a clean shell without any frustrations, irritations that you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, I had Steve's words ringing in my mind when we went in there, but then you look at it and you go, well, could this be of value? You ask the question to yourself, but your help and advice on that was good. It really reconfirmed, okay, no, stick with lease aggravation. We don't need them here. And the other thing I remember thinking about at that time was the solar panels on the roof. And I was not against the solar panels on the roof, but I was equally not for them until we found out what was going on with them, because that's not too dissimilar. You could have solar panels which circa have a life 15 years. If you get stuck with solar panels which are 13 years old, okay, 2 years' time, you're going to be pulling them off the roof and have to get them replaced. So it just, again, may cause a headache. As it turns out, those solar panels are only 5 years old, and we took the view that, no, they're worth... they're staying and they're worth something to the building. Yeah.
I think that is gold. You know, when you're having a look at a building and you're seeing all of these parts, you really have hit the nail on the head there, you know, with like solar panels, for instance, and moving parts. And I always say, look at all the moving parts. You've got roller shutter doors, you've got air cons, you've got gantries, you've got solar. You know, those are all mechanical moving parts. I talk about the moving parts. Do your due diligence on all of those bits and pieces, because you need to weigh up at the end of the day whether they're going to cost you or whether they're going to add value to your building. Are they going to cost you when you've got another tenant coming in, or are they going to add value that you can actually hand over to the next tenant?
And yeah. And those solar panels will do that, because if we had a 2-year sale lease back with an option. So some would say that's a little skinny in terms of the timing of the lease, but I was comfortable with it. But at the end of that 2 years, if they do move on, there's good life left in those solar panels. There's good value left in there for the client coming in.
Yep, I would agree with you. And I think all in all, the experience to getting to that lease, like I was saying, I remember there being a couple of grisly moments where we had to do some fairly hard negotiating. And I remember you phoning me with, it felt like you had your head in your hand while we were having the conversation about what to do. And I remember my advice is just be rational. Just be absolutely 100% rational. Think about yourself over here. What are you going to need in long term, and what is going to serve you best when this tenant leaves? That's it, bottom. Yeah. So they must come to the party as well.
Yeah. And as time goes on now, post that transaction, which we may talk about a bit later, it becomes normalized then. So you're in a different space, and the little problems or things that might come up, it's okay, it's fine. You know, we're sort of used to that and adapting, and we're on our way. So I suspect we might talk about that a bit later in another conversation.
I think we will. I think we've tapped off on quite a lot here. The one thing that I just wanted to ask, do you remember what the time frame was approximately from the time that we found this property right through until the time that you settled?
Yeah, so we settled November 23. It wasn't that long ago. We were working on that property. And when I say working on it, there was a period of time where they had to go away and do a few things for that certificate of completion, which from memory was about 6 weeks to 2 months. So you've got to throw that in there in the mix. So if you work backwards, I think we engaged in that property in June or maybe even May, possibly, from memory.
I'll have to look at my records, but I think towards the end of May, early June, and full transaction. And yes, we stopped all negotiation. We said we would not go any further until they sorted that out.
Yeah,
gave them their time, and I think you're right. They took around about 6 weeks, maybe a little bit longer, and that was the time when we went out to the second property, which we've already discussed. But from the time that we went to contract to completion, it was around about 60 days, 65 days. We made decisions, did the due diligence, dived in. They had the certificates, everything ticking off the boxes, and hit the green light. So
that part of the process, was definitely went quite smoothly, because I guess in some respects, once you do that pre-work around the certificate of completion, you're asking a few other questions, and we'd done a bit of work on that contract prior to the official DD date and going on deposit and so forth. We had done a bit of that pre-work already. So, that we were fine-tuning, I guess, once we're really going on to DD.
Yeah.
So
on average, is commercial for sissies?
If you've got a good bias, no, it's fine. You could be anyone do it. Absolutely. But it can be a bit tetchy in there sometimes. With different things. There's a lot of moving pieces. I think that's what attracts me to it in a way. Apart from the asset and what you're trying to achieve financially, the actual, I guess, the complexity and the thrill of the transaction is interesting. It's completely different to buying a residential property, obviously.
Bingo.
Yeah. So lots of moving pieces. If you're prepared to do that and you're still a sissy, you'll be fine. No, it takes some good due diligence. You've just got to hang in there to a point and be persistent on it, because it is worth it, in my view, for sure. But nothing comes easy. The good stuff you want doesn't come easy. So you just got to work through it.
Absolutely. And I think a great analogy with that is throwing a ball in a basketball hoop. You never get it in the first time. So you threw the ball 22 times, or let's say we threw the ball 22 times, and that's what it is. It's trial and error. And really, if you're finding a property too simply, too fast, start questioning why. Because it's residential, yeah, sure, easy peasy. Even in residential, I remember looking at 100 properties before I settled on my residential property, and that's going 10 years back when the market wasn't so hot. So maybe I'm a little bit more fussy. I'd like to think that I'm relaying that to my clients at the same time as well. Be fussy, okay?
Yeah.
And ask questions. But trial and error. So great. Well, the next show we'll drill down a little bit, and we'll have a look at the journey since settlement and what's transpired and what's come out of it and where to from here.
Yeah, fantastic. Sounds good, Mesh. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for joining me.